I live on a farm in Kentucky. We moved here about 4.5 years ago now. We have about 20 goats on our farm, as well as over 100 chickens. It has become my opinion, and it has only grown stronger with time, that spending at least a year tending livestock should be a requirement for becoming a pastor. Sounds funny, I know, but it's true. You don't really understand what it means to shepherd a flock until you've done it literally. There's a difference between a shepherd and a preacher. The preacher gets up into the pulpit every Sunday morning and spends an hour talking. The shepherd spends every day tending to the needs of their flock. The shepherd checks their food and water every day. Doesn't get a day off. Animals need to eat. They need to drink. They need to have clean bedding. The shepherd gets to know each one of them by name, their personalities, which animals tend to form a clique and which are left on the outside, which animals are the alphas and which are at the bottom of the ranking order. The shepherd observes who's getting enough food and who's not, who's taking too much and who's being shoved away from the feed tin. Preachers observe none of these things. They don't need to. The preachers who put on Sunday morning shows, quote unquote, observe none of these things. Their job isn't to get to know and look after their charges. It's just to say a liturgy, preach for an hour once or twice a week, look good on a stage or in front of a camera. I recently watched the film Man of God about Saint Nectarius of the Greek Orthodox Church. This man was a shepherd. I highly recommend the film. He screamed shepherd. Mother Teresa was a shepherd too, regardless of her rank or status. I can think of others, both real and fictional. Honestly, I myself wasn't a very good shepherd when I wore the collar. And I did. I served in 2 different parishes, in St. Jude's Old Catholic Church in Huntington Beach and All Saints Old Catholic Church in Clarksville, Tennessee. I didn't really understand what being a shepherd meant. I loved being Jesus for people and giving Jesus to people in the sacraments, but I didn't really get the actual shepherd part. Whether that was due to my autism spectrum disorder or just my own immaturity, I don't know. But I wish I had gotten it. I know I would have done things differently if I had been able to relate to the people who came under my charge half as well as I find myself looking after and caring for the animals under my charge. Those goats, dogs, cats, and chickens have taught me more about pastoring than any of the courses I had ever taken in college, or many of the pastors I have ever seen. When Jesus looked at you, spoke with you, addressed you, or even glanced at you, you were his whole world, and you felt that you were his whole world. It didn't matter if he was just mentioning something to you, telling a story to a group, verbally chastising you, or just looking in your direction for a brief second. You knew where you stood with him, and you stood at the center of his world all the time. It was both comforting and overwhelming. It was the safest feeling in the world and the most vulnerable. He looked at you and he knew. Didn't matter what was going on with you, he just knew. And his expression always bore that out. He could say, I know, I love you, I feel what you're feeling, with just a glance. When you cried, he cried with you. When you laughed, he laughed with you. Wherever you were at in that moment, he was there with you, without condemnation, without blame, and always wanting you to succeed in following the way he taught. He was the shepherd who kept eyes on all of his sheep, knew each of them by name, and knew exactly when one of them wasn't where they were supposed to be, and would move heaven and earth searching for them until they were found and brought home. This is the example he left for those of us called to be his assistant shepherds. Like him, we do it because we love, and are to practice the love he displayed. We do not do it for money. We do not do it for ego. We do it because he trusted us to do it. We do it whether he entrusted us with a flock of thousands or just one. We do it whether they are all in one pasture or if we run across one of them lost out in the wild. We embody and channel him for his sheep, caring for them as he would, treating them kindly, calling them by name, mending their wounds, feeding them with good feed, and staying by them as they recover from bad, just as he would. We are not mentors. We are not life coaches, and we are not public speakers. We are not counselors or therapists. We are shepherds. And while our job as shepherds may entail aspects of all of these positions, our primary occupation is concerned with caring for the sheep and making sure they are healthy, sound, fed, and loved as he loves them. Sometimes this entails milking them to wean the lambs. Sometimes it entails shearing them to make sure their coats don't get too big and harm them. Sometimes it means separating the lambs from their mothers in order to wean them off the milk and get them eating grass, grain, and hay so that they can mature properly. Sometimes it means castrating some of the males to keep them from fighting and hurting one another. But all of this is done in order to make sure they're all healthy and the flock is healthy and sound. All too often, shepherds within the church forget what it means to be a shepherd, to imitate the shepherd, and what it means to take care of the owner's flock. Years ago, a kind of vision came to me as I was working at a Walmart in Orange County, California. It went like this. There was a rancher who owned a lot of sheep, and shepherds were hired to watch over different flocks. Some flocks were larger, some were smaller, but all of the sheep belonged ultimately to the rancher, not the individual shepherd in charge of them. Some of the shepherds were doing their job well and faithfully. The sheep were well cared for, and the shepherds had the exhaustion and bags under their eyes to prove it. Other shepherds, however, were not. Some beat the sheep under their care, some didn't feed them properly. Others overfed them, but then didn't exercise them. Some were abused in other ways, or poisoned because the shepherd didn't seem to know the difference between good feed and bad. Some shepherds were fleecing the sheep far too often, and as such they were sick and ill-prepared for the winter. As a result, some sheep broke from their flocks and stalls and ran for the hills, terrified of the shepherds put over them. Out in the hills, some of them were able to survive on their own, and were doing okay for the most part. Others, however, got into poisonous plants. Some couldn't traverse the terrain and were injured, many of them quite seriously. Others ate themselves over cliffs, as sheep are quite capable of doing. And as I saw this in my head, I could sense the concern the rancher had for his sheep, which had fled. I could also sense the anger which he had towards the shepherds in question, to whom he had entrusted his livestock. This is probably one of the hardest forms of abuse to talk about for any Christian, because we are conditioned from the beginning to submit to those in spiritual authority over us. They are supposed to have the answers and are supposed to guide us into a closer relationship with the Lord. When we join a church or a Christian organization, we put ourselves into the vulnerable position of obedience to that church and that church's leadership's authority over us, because that is what we are taught to do by Holy Scripture and by common universal tradition within the church. And any dissent from the teaching of that church leadership or accusation against that church leadership is almost automatically seen and dealt with as heresy and divisiveness. We are taught that we need the communion, fellowship, and ordinances or sacraments of that church, and sometimes only that church, in order to remain right with God. This kind of abuse happens when this is used as leverage by the church leadership and other members of the congregation to extort money, favors, position, agreement with their decisions, no matter how hurtful they may be, etc., from a church member. They are threatened with excommunication, shaming, and loss of friends and even family if they don't comply. Another kind of abuse happens when a church leader simply puts his own interests above the interests of those in his congregation who need his counsel, support, and guidance. This is the abuse of pastoral neglect. In the same way, and using much the same leverage, pastors, priests, and other church leaders can also experience the same kind of abuse at the hands of their own pastoral superiors, or in the case of more democratic churches, at the hands of their own congregations. The victims of this abuse are made to feel like they're the ones doing something wrong. They're the heretics. They're the ones causing the problem. They're too needy. They need to suck it up and get a life. What can be worse is those within the church who haven't gone through it and who don't understand. This isn't Jesus. And I'm sorry that that's not obvious, but this isn't Jesus. This isn't what he taught. But all too often, because people begin to associate their church leaders with Jesus, they react to him as though he is the one abusing or neglecting them, when nothing could be farther from the truth. God is not the abuser. He is not the one, he is the one who heals, comforts, and loves his sheep. This is the first distinction which must be made clear, so that in fleeing these abusive shepherds, we don't run from our owner.